We are live on SpiceFM around the country. We are broadcasting this show around the world on SpiceFM KE, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. Yes, they're up now, they're running. And we're also on www.spicefm.co.ke. For the next 1 hour, we are also live on KTN Home. A very good audience. Morning to our audience on TV joining us this morning. Let's start with the day's proverb. CT.
The dead have no clear drinking straw.
The dead have no clear drinking straw.
Yes. This is a proverb from the western part of our country. And I am not certain whether it comes from the Rama, whether it comes from, put it this way, I am not certain which community it comes from, but I know what it says. And I'm going to try as best as I can to read it in the language that it was written in.
Okay.
Abafwa babula olutseshe lulera.
Abafwa babula olutseshe lulera.
Yes.
I think somebody on social media even confirmed those words. Said, they were trying to explain, to translate word for word. Abafwa babula olutseshe lulera. The dead
have no clear drinking straw.
The dead have no clear drinking straw.
Yes.
Okay. It's a very nice and interesting proverb, this one. Interesting proverb. So shall we open up the box now? The Pandora's box. The Pandora papers leaked, and they're talking about, people who have offshore accounts, who are holding accounts in various countries. And of course, the major global publications, first of all, needed to focus, and they focused on the big names in each country. In our country, for example, our President Uhuru Kenyatta was mentioned as he and his family having been said to hold some accounts there. The president yesterday released a statement and said, the Pandora's box, this information will go a long way in enhancing financial transparency and openness that we require in Kenya and around the globe. It's a good thing. But what exactly does it mean? When you talk about people holding accounts in offshore accounts, is it tax havens? Are they hidden accounts? Numbered accounts? You watch movies and you just see someone Jason Bourne asking to be paid through a numbered account. What does that all mean? And what's the benefit of that? We have also discussed it here before. Companies that are registered in some countries, they are operating in Kenya. What does that mean? Is it a benefit to the company? Is it a benefit to the country? Does it have any implication on tax revenues and collection? Remember, we're talking about taxes and revenue collection in the previous hour. The implications of all that. We have two guests to help us discuss this morning. One of them joins us via video link. Everlyn Muendo, a policy assistant at the Tax Justice Network Africa. She's been on the show before. Evelyn, a very good morning to you.
Morning. Thank you so much for having me yet again. I'm really, really excited about this topic today.
Of course you are. This is your bread and butter. You do this on a daily basis. The other person who has lived this life of basically just looking at international tax and international tax laws and practices is James Karanja. He's an international tax expert. He is in the studio. James, good morning.
Good morning, Eric.
Good to have you in the show.
Thank you.
And occupying that seat. We call that the hot seat for people who are coming to give us stories. But now, because you're coming to create awareness and educate us, we will not make it hot. We'll just make it warm.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Let's just start with you, James. When you talk about offshore accounts, these words, tax havens, what do they mean? First, let's start with the tax haven. What's a tax haven?
So there's no internationally accepted definition for what a tax haven is, but there are certain characteristics that make up for what is a tax haven. And one of those is the low tax, the fact that the jurisdiction is extremely low tax. We're talking anything below perhaps 12.5%, or less than 15% would be what you'd call a low tax jurisdiction. There's always the incidence of high secrecy, that there's a lot of confidentiality around who are the owners, where the assets of the organization are kept. So that information, those registries are very private, and that information is not readily accessible to any regulator. And finally, I think it's the aspect that these jurisdictions will often have regimes that allow people to set up business that is beneficial, that is of tax benefit to them.
The initial connotation obviously being that there's something untoward happening should you be looking for a place to keep assets or to keep money in large amounts without many questions and with the ultimate secrecy being kept for you. Do the two always go hand in hand, secrecy with something untoward happening?
First, I think to be clear that it is legitimate for any person to open an account wherever in a place of your choice. I mean, we're all global citizens. It is your right to set up an account wherever. And so I think the first implication should not always be that there's a purpose, yes, that is not legitimate, but to say that yes, certainly these forums have created avenues for people to do a number of things. I think my good friend Edward Machinga, my old classmate from the law school, would say it is legitimate for people to plan their affairs towards being able to minimize your tax. And this is particularly important when you're operating not just in one jurisdiction, but you're multi-jurisdictional. Is it your business to ensure that you maximize how much tax you pay, or is always the purpose of a business to maximize its own shareholder value? So when you're operating across jurisdictions, obviously there's what you'd call legitimate tax planning, the ability to shelter your income in places that it doesn't subject it to the maximum amount of tax you want to pay as little as possible. Now, what has happened? The rules reached a place where they were so broken that people, you hear the big companies, the Google, Facebook, pay an effective tax rate of 0%, 1%, almost nothing compared to what you and I would pay as an effective tax rate. So clearly, the tax havens became a big issue, especially after the global financial crisis. And the issue of bank secrecy now was something that people, the world leaders, were paying attention to because, and this is important, money in private hands, how much public good does it do as opposed to when that is in the hands of government? Now, it's a big question because...
Money in private hands as opposed to money in government.
In government. I'll give you an example. Elon Musk today, the richest guy in the world, today is doing what? His frontiers of...
he's taking us
energy,
to space.
Energy cars, he's taking us into space.
Clean cars.
Using his own personal funds. That is money in private hands. Now, on the other hand, you have money in the hands of government, where government is able to now provide these resources to provide public goods. And take, for example, NASA, that used to do space flight, but today, now, is also relying on private sector. So there's no morality in in whose hands should money always be. I think what is important in this is a system of checks and balances. This is legitimate to plan your affairs, but nevertheless, surely there's an issue not of morality, but one, I think, of every party in this game looking to ensure that you can maximize what you get. Governments will do what they need to do to maximize their tax returns for public good. The private sector will do the same for purposes of, expanding their own personal interest, which in certain instances, in places where markets are efficient, you're going to now have a very good provision of services, as opposed to where there is no effective business running, and therefore nothing that people can go to. We're grateful, to just say we can go to Nakumat, we could go to these big malls, as opposed to when you had a small kiosk. So big money in private hands has also good benefits.
Okay. I'm looking at our country, and I'm looking at the banking sector, and I'm looking at the term confidentiality. As we speak right now, any account held by any citizen of this country or by anyone is not something that is in the public domain that anybody can have access to. So that's confidentiality. Now, as somebody who understands this, even our laws only allow certain agencies and certain people following a certain process for them to be able to access knowledge about an account.
Correct.
How does this concept of confidentiality differ with the concept of confidentiality in these accounts that are referred to as offshore accounts or accounts in other jurisdictions?
Okay, so bank secrecy is a sacrosanct principle of the banking system, and to be fair, this is what has really driven the growth of the banking sector, say in Switzerland and other offshore jurisdictions. And the same applies to Kenya now. How is this an issue? When, after 2009, the G20 world leaders say we're bringing an end to bank secrecy, but what does that mean? It doesn't mean that Tom, Dick, and Harry will go and access information about the other person's account. It just means that you've put in place a system through which governments, tax administrations that need to access this information can share it in an effective manner between themselves. So that is the system that the Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes has put in place. And now there's that effort towards putting in place legal instruments that would allow that information to be shared.
And what necessitated this? I mean, because previously it clearly didn't exist, and that was for a reason. And then the G20, or is it G10 or G8?
G20.
Okay, the G. The G come in and decide that this is what they want. What pushed them to come or to arrive at this decision?
So there's that expression, greed is good. And that if you leave people to do what they want to do and they let them maximize their own gain, the financial crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, was driven first by unchecked or unregulated business that was doing extremely risky business. Now, on the other hand, governments also reached a place where they realized the private money is so much more in private hands than it was in the hands of government. And it was time to check the secrecy because now this seriously impacted on the ability to collect revenue from the private sector. So 60-70% of the revenue we collect in Kenya, for instance, comes from the top corporates. The little mwananchi, the mwananchi out here pays, if you look, the small things that are collected constitute about 30-40%. So if your 60%, 70% are people who can hide the finances they have in a place where you cannot reach it and tax it, clearly governments now are beginning to raise questions about how do they tap into the secrecy because that tax has to be collected.
Let's bring in Everlyn into the conversation. As you're nodding, and you basically are agreeing with what James is saying, this issue of secrecy and tax havens, as we say, private sector trying to hide its money away from government, but it's being facilitated by governments. These are governments that have basically created these tax havens, that's the low tax regimes, that are also encouraging the lack of transparency. So why would a government decide to set up such a system in its country? How does it benefit?
Thank you so much. I think that's a really important question. Firstly, I'd like to politely disagree with my fellow guests and say that this is most definitely a matter of morality. Just as it may not be illegal per se, it may not be illegitimate as per the laws that exist globally as well as locally, but this is most definitely a matter of morality. It is clearly immoral what is happening right now. So what I can say is most governments set up such structures and essentially create offshore financial systems in the name of attracting foreign direct investment and increasing economic development in their country. But the problem with introducing such structures and such systems in your country is that, yes, your own country will develop. I mean, there are very many countries which are supported, whose economies are supported simply by, offshore financial systems, but it's at the expense of other countries. I'll give a good example of Mauritius, which is probably the most famous offshore financial center in this part of the world, at least in the African part of the world. And you've seen that in the recent past, there have been a lot of African countries that have been putting a stop to their ties with Mauritius because they realize that they are losing out a lot, especially in terms of capital flight as well as taxes, because of having taxation agreements with Mauritius. So Mauritius will benefit, but the rest of the countries that have any sort of relations with Mauritius are not benefiting from it. It's to our detriment, in fact. Yeah.
So when we say that, Mauritius is looking at this, setting it up so that it can benefit, it's not the only country. So all these countries in the world that have set this systems up for themselves are looking at benefiting directly. Do they really also just benefit? Is it benefiting because money has been put in the bank in your country and therefore you have access to it, or are you also able to benefit from taxing? Because I'm assuming that what, James, you've said is if the government is unable to extend its hand and grab something out of this from tax, then the government is not benefiting. So how is Mauritius or any of these tax havens benefiting, Everlyn?
I have to say that it's a bit of a wonder, because what often happens is that with this, what I'll call offshore financial centers or tax havens, to be very blunt, what happens is that they don't tax at all in most instances. In fact, in some of these tax havens, they don't have income taxes at all. But what they do is that they set up sort of like a professional system, and they make it very easy for these businesses to set up. And so they'll benefit from simply having the capital flow into their country. And of course, that won't be the final destination of the investment, but they're benefiting from being the middleman, so to speak. I hope that's
what you say is clear, but there's an underlying unstated factor with all this, that this money has some nefarious background. The origins are unclear, the sources that they obtain from not clear, and usually with reference to third world banana republics like ours, the reference is that money was stolen from government coffers. But the enterprise of offshore banking, as we call it, is it illegitimate? I think not.
It's legitimate.
It's legitimate. Yes, meaning a country has understood that this is something they can do, and they have those laws in their country which enables someone to come and do whatever it is that they wish. And the very countries, these G8 countries that signed all these laws permitting other countries to understand how they can benefit from this, this is the question I'm asking. Did it arise? James has actually explained it well, but if you look at many of the issues that have arisen, it has arisen with leaders who happen to be presidents or leaders of third world countries, developing countries, or countries that at the best of times have had issues, many issues. We don't see fingers being pointed to developed nations and political leaders in developed nations. So would I be right in arguing that the reason why the discussion around offshore banking, the reason why it raises temperatures is because very many people who are associated with it happen to be either political leaders or presidents of the countries that have the background that I have mentioned.
Okay, that is true. There is one aspect of it where you're seeing politically exposed persons taking advantage of the secrecy and the weakness of the international financial system to hide money which they illegally acquired through corruption or other illegal means. And a good example is also Isabel dos Santos from Angola. And then there's also the other side of it, whereby it's not just politically exposed persons, it's wealthy individuals, and also it's multinational enterprises that are hiding or channeling their money through these tax havens or offshore financial centers for the sole purposes of reducing their tax liabilities. You know, they want to maximize the profits that they have, and they operate in a lot of countries. And, you know, let's say, for instance, the corporate income tax in Kenya is 30%, in another country, 25%. So they want to reduce the tax liability. So what they'll do is that they'll make sure that they channel the money through Mauritius or another international financial center or offshore financial center in order to reduce the tax liability. So there are two aspects of it. There's the aspect of tax avoidance, which is not illegal per se. In fact, it is a legitimate, it's business acumen, it's good business acumen. But when it's aggressively done to this standard, then it's completely immoral, and in my humble opinion, it should also be made illegal. I'll just give an example. Between the year 1975 and 2015, the 30 African countries lost about 1.4 trillion because of capital flight, because of multinational enterprises and wealthy individuals and politically exposed persons who are channeling their money into the international financial system in order to avoid their tax liabilities, or in order to avoid, being tracked, because the money must have come from illegal sources. So imagine Africa right now is in a state where we are resorting towards unsustainable means of financing our government, financing our public resources, and that is through debt. And what we're saying is, if we could curb this capital flight, if we could curb this illicit financial flows, then we could very easily manage to sustain ourselves as an African continent. So this is definitely not a matter of legitimacy.
It's a moral issue. And
morality.
The debate will obviously always go into who regulates morality and who decides what's moral and what's immoral. And moral is by whose standards. So what are these things? The tax havens, offshore accounts, people keeping money in offshore accounts. What's wrong with that? How does it benefit them? How does it benefit their countries, or how does it benefit the countries in which those accounts are held? In the studio with us is James Karanja, is an international tax expert, and joining us on video link is Everlyn Muendo, policy assistant at the Tax Justice Network Africa. James, as we were going into the break, Everlyn had just talked about, the issue of morality. It's immoral for some of these countries to open to have these systems in place. It's also immoral for some people to take money out of here and go and take it into those places. There's a discussion there and a wide-ranging debate on the definition of morality. But also in the definition, like you gave us, of the tax havens, and you told us, so tax haven it's a country where low tax regime. Therefore, it's attracting people to come who are looking for paying as little tax as possible. And then there's a second aspect of it, which is the secrecy, which is what the G20 countries and the others decided to come together and start pushing for more openness on this. Tell us about this openness, the lack of transparency of the accounts to the regulators and the tax authorities. Why is it a big issue? I mean, why the push toward this? You participated in these conversations as well yourself. Maybe you can actually even just give us a bit of a background on some of the work that you've done on this front.
Thank you, Eric. And just quickly about my background. I've worked with the Kenya Revenue Authority for about 15 years, where I was leading the work on international tax and the transparency. It took Kenya through its 2 peer reviews with the Global Forum on Transparency. Got to be an assessor myself of some of the jurisdictions out there. And finally got to work with the OECD for about 5 years. So I've been involved in a lot of policy making, also sitting at the table, the steering committee of the Global Forum and the OECD Committee on Fiscal Affairs. So I'd say over the last few years, I've had quite an opening into what is happening. And I'd like to say a point, I think, to respond to also an issue that Muga raised. It is legitimate for any person to keep an account wherever they want to keep it. It's legitimate for people to do business where they want to do it and to try and maximize their gains as much as possible. Now, what is the problem? Why is transparency an issue? Why? And I want to first laud the work of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. What they're doing is commendable. They do a lot of painstaking work to put all this together. They take a lot of personal risk. And I want to commend even for journalists anywhere in Kenya, the social ills of any society could be addressed when journalists also step in. So why is it important for you to have transparency? It doesn't matter. If you're doing your business, you're doing it legitimately, then you have nothing to hide. The issue you raise, Muga, this is just about banana republics? Is it just about African despots? Heck no. We've seen names there of Tony Blair. I mean, we've seen names, people, prominent people out there, Putin, yes. So let's be clear that greed is global. It's not just an African phenomenon, but certainly Africa was a lot more affected by the fact that from a governance perspective, we have very weak institutions. From looking also at the ability for these governments the capacity to deal with these issues is also very low. Then it becomes a question, hey, wait, morality. Can the companies say, okay, now this is what you've done is legal, but can you look into this and see what you can do different? So let me say this in response to my colleague Everlyn. It is proper, and it is actually a movement now by companies to do what they call responsible taxation. And I want to refer you to a team of CEOs that came together that they call themselves a B team and said, look, we have things we're not going to do. We're not going to take our money into tax havens for the sake of it. We are going to be open and transparent to governments. So, and Bob Collymore, the late Bob Collymore, was a big proponent of the work of the B team. This is excellent. This is business saying we are also part of the move that can help to move the SDGs. Companies also have a role to play to pay, to put back to society. So either through directly or through what they put back into government. So I want, my last point on this is that the international system is actually very skewed. Because it's a competition. It's who has power. The US can put in place a system like FATCA to get information about foreign accounts of its own citizens, but will not reciprocate, will not participate in any reciprocal arrangements. Two, will not even support efforts. They're not part of the global system on a common reporting system, which is about automatic exchange of information. They will not support the beneficial ownership system that is put in place by the Global Forum. So I must say there's a lot of hypocrisy in that international system.
What you mean is that, for instance, if somebody has money in the States, there's no guarantee that system will automatically give the information to, say, some other country seeking that information.
So if you're a US citizen, from wherever you are, you can't hide.
Yes, however,
to the reverse, the US have very few agreements about who they can give information.
That's why also if an individual such as myself, like Eric and I have a company,
right,
and we have money in the US,
right,
they are not under any obligation because they haven't signed any agreement to release information about the money we have in that country.
Correct.
To Kenya.
Correct. And so they're actually recognized as among the top 5, actually top 2 tax havens in the world for that reason. And this is what I'm saying. The people who get affected are the small island states. They're the ones who get... So there's a political argument in this. It's about a competition for resources. So I must say, there is a lot of hypocrisy about this system and how it is run.
What stops Kenya from being a tax haven?
Actually, I must say, Kenya has a big qualification already on being a tax haven, and this is about secrecy. Our beneficial ownership, the ability to know who owns company X, company Y. And you see it all the time, even when parliamentary committee is sitting and they're asking who owns this clinic.
And they hit a brick wall.
And they hit a brick wall.
Yeah.
And the company register would come, and that information is not available. So we do have a strong qualification already
Right.
To be classified as.
to be classified as a tax haven.
James, then, and also for you, Evelyn, then perhaps what Evelyn is saying then does have some merit, because if we're looking at then issues to do with morality, because it is clear that the reasons why this money is being kept in these tax havens is not solely to be able to maximize on profits, that there is clearly another reason why this money is being, and not just not across the board, but by some individuals, by some institutions. And it is not just to make a maximum profit, but that it is also to be able to hide the reasons as to why would have to be proven one to the other. But it is obvious that if you want to hide something, then perhaps the source of that thing or the reason behind it is not as clear as day. And that there is something that you want to hide from, and that's why you're putting it there. That's why it was such an eyebrow-raising moment for the Globe when this came out, because much more than you can actually fathom is being hidden, and the reasons behind that also being hidden. So isn't that why then you should be able to look at it with a little bit more scrutiny and say, all right, in as much as people are making maximum profits on their business, that there's nefarious activity behind the sources of these funds in some cases.
Certainly, and I don't want to begrudge the argument on morality. What I want to say is that, and I want to take an example of Mauritius within the East African context. The East African countries, these are Kenya and its East African regional partners. These are the biggest trading partners. We don't have a tax treaty between these countries. Now, what does Equity Bank, Kenya Commercial Bank, do if they want to operate in these countries? You actually have a situation where you're exposed to taxation in both countries in a way that is not beneficial to the business. So what would they do? Logically, in the absence of a framework like that, they now have to look for a landing spot where you then manage your affairs. So what I want to say, the morality issue is certainly one, makes the case for more transparency in what is going on, that you should not keep those things hidden. But that said, if you are within your legal right to do something, and then certainly do it, and let governments also come back. And I began with this point, checks and balances.
Right.
Money is not, or financial resources have to operate as efficiently as possible in whichever hands they lie. So the private sector have a role to play, and the government also has a role to play. And then once there are checks and balances in this system, then it works. But when that system is broken down, that's where there's a problem.
That's where there's a problem.
Yeah.
Evelyn, have we seen, I'm looking at a global, on a global scale now, that there have been individuals to whom this tax haven activity have been called out, and to see that the funds that they have kept away can be linked to any kind of untoward activity. Have we seen that, examples of such around the world that could then attribute a little bit more to what you're saying?
Yes, we have. I mentioned the example of Isabel dos Santos, and it was actually the work of the very same journalist who released the Pandora leaks, that is the Luanda leaks. And it was a very good example of, a wealthy individual with very strong political connections taking advantage of that position and using the offshore financial system to hide wealth, to do unscrupulous activities and such. I'd also like to really just emphasize on the issue of morality. I keep emphasizing on that issue because I want Kenyans, and not just Kenyans, but, residents of the world to be enraged by what is happening. It isn't just, I have so much to say, but let me take myself slowly. The issue of capital flight and illicit financial flows is a bigger elephant in the room than the issue of corruption. It is very clearly linked to the issue of human rights abuses, because essentially what you're doing is you're allowing human traffickers, you're allowing drug traffickers, you're allowing terrorists financiers to have a system which they can use to hide their money and to finance their activities. And it isn't just about, politicians and prominent people also abusing that system and hiding their wealth. It's also about multinational enterprises benefiting from the infrastructure that is set up by the government, but refusing to pay their fair share of taxes and leaving the majority or the bigger share of taxes to be paid by ordinary Kenyans, such as you and I, or by ordinary citizens. So I'll just give an example yet again of the earlier statistics that I had mentioned. This isn't something that started in the last decade or, within the 21st century. This has been a system that has been operating, how we say it in Kiswahili as chini ya maji, or underneath the waters or below the radar for years and years, and it's been benefiting wealthy individuals, it's been benefiting multinational enterprises and, political persons who are taking advantage of the public offices that they've been given, and we are losing serious resources because of this. So it is also a matter of efficiency, if we're going to talk about efficiency. As I mentioned, we lost 1.4 trillion from the 1970s to 2015. We lost $50 billion in 2015 alone because of illicit financial flows and capital flight. I think I don't want to trivialize it by saying that it's a matter of morality, but I think that as African countries, as Kenyans also, especially since we've seen that the Pandora list is also connected to us, we really do need to start paying more attention to it and start getting enraged by this issue because we're losing a lot of resources.
Evelyn, if I may just say this, what you're saying is true, and the moral issue cannot be downplayed no matter how hard one tries to. But the reason why politicians are a focus of our discussion on this continent is because, especially presidents or those associated with them, is because they also happen to be some of the wealthiest people in the country. But there are countries in the world, and there are individuals even in this country or in East Africa, who are wealthy in their own rights because they're businessmen and women. And many people who have the ability and because they understand, remember, people don't go into business for philanthropic reasons. They go into business to make money. And if they can legally ensure that they maximize on their profits, they will do so. Now, the morality issue comes in when it is clear that public coffers are actually being plundered. And then that money can be traced to some of these accounts. But then if you talk about it globally, some of the wealthiest people are not government. They're just individuals and their businesses. Corporate entities are also extremely wealthy. And the reason why these businesses exist is because there is a market for that business. And that's why they're tax havens. There's a market for it. And I feel that simply because we belong to a country that has for the longest time had politicians who have done the very things they're not supposed to do, and people who within government have helped plunder our coffers, it then doesn't mean that we shouldn't open our eyes to the reality that anyone who is a business individual or people who are business, who have an inclination towards business, will look for means and ways of ensuring that whatever they're seeking to do, that is make money, that money is protected in the best way that they can.
Is one of the best ways then secrecy?
Actually, I'm glad you asked the question because I have to ask the question, what is wrong with secrecy? Because it's being mentioned as though secrecy is this terrible thing that you can't have. What is wrong with secrecy?
To the extent that it impacts on the ability of a government to know whether you ought to pay, whether you are entitled to pay tax or not, then that becomes an issue. But as far as between Muga and James, I should not know what is kept in your accounts. And a really interesting point Eric raised here about, who are priests in the church of morality. That is a huge, huge question. And here, what it behooves governments to do is to invest in being part of an international cooperation system where they have ability to access this information, because Eric and James and Muga will not contribute. If you think about it, if you have two petrol stations, one here they're selling the taxed petrol for 130 and the other one is selling at 60, which is the price without tax, please tell me, where does your rational mind take you?
You'll go to the 60 bob one.
I mean, and that's the human nature. Whether you are the big corporate or you are the small Mwananchi down there, we would all like to have an opportunity to save the shilling and extend it to do as much as possible. So,
So then where do you draw the line between what human nature is likely to do or operate and then what you would ask of individuals to operate in the right way, regardless of who the high chieftain of the high priest of morality is? Where do you draw that line?
So I think this line, it just means in a system where we're trying to live together, we're living under state, the state has an obligation, one, to put in place checks and balances that check your greed and check my greed, check and provide the tools itself with the tool, equip itself with the tools to be able to check you and I, because we will not, when we talk about morality, we want to cooperate.
But also to check the possible excesses of government and government agencies. Because if I'm thinking of, say, a simple banking system like what we have in Kenya, if these checks aren't there, then it means anyone can have access to my account.
Correct.
So long as they're a government agency, the police can, just think, the anti-corruption, anybody can have access to it. But the systems we have in this country, you will need to go to court to get a court order, which means you have to prove that you need to do that. Now, it's a check and balance, and I think the check and balance is good. But even more importantly, the debate around it and the information is even better. Because anytime you mention offshore banking, no one thinks of businessmen who are simply seeking ways of maximize their profit. You think of somebody who has looted public coffers and then spirited the money abroad.
May I think about somebody who's, ongoing at that moment, looting, not by taking from the public coffers, by denying the public what they should be getting. Because that's the whole point. When you're putting it in secrecy, you are, just like James is explaining, you are shielding the government from accessing that information and also from knowing how much they should tax you. If they don't get access to tax you, and they are building roads, they're building hospitals, they're building other public facilities,
you have nothing to look for.
And you are using those public facilities to enrich yourself more and more, then you are stealing from public coffers.
Indeed, Eric.
Everlyn, why do you agree that there's nothing wrong with secrecy?
No. I'll take I'll take the radical approach, and I think there's something seriously wrong with it. I think that these leaks show that there's a serious problem with the transparency systems that we do have. The checks and balances that my dear colleague was speaking of are clearly inadequate if we're only finding out about these unscrupulous activities through the leaks, through investigative journalism, through whistleblowing. Then clearly you can see that a system has been formulated that very, very deliberately wants to hide these wealthy individuals and these political and prominent people, as well as these multinational enterprises, so that they can maximize and benefit from the funds, which, whether they get them legally or illegally, they are getting. I also wanted to emphasize that, as had earlier been stated, tax avoidance is not necessarily illegitimate. It's legitimate as per the law. As a lawyer, I can tell you that there isn't a law, at least in Kenya's case, which says that it's illegal to avoid taxes. But the issue is the way it's being done and the standard to which it's being done. It's being aggressively done. And what we're seeing is that a lot of African countries are losing resources through this. Whether or not they are getting their resources in a legal manner, as had been mentioned earlier, we're living in a capitalist country whereby the market forces will go where there is most profit and they will try their best to maximize their profits. But we have to remember that at the end of the day, these businesses also benefit from the public resources that they find. They benefit from the labor and they benefit from the well-educated labor, and that is the government doing. They benefit from the existing infrastructure. They benefit from the political stability. They benefit from the legal such
Everything that's been put in place by, ordinary good-paying taxpayers. What is it that ought to be done to increase its transparency in the financial system, in the global financial system, so that more and more governments are able to dip their hands into people's earnings and tax and then provide services to both the rich and the poor?
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.